two individuals here today, Mark Sessumes and Kristi Boyette. I did not clear that name before we started, so sorry about that. But I believe they're going to start off, we're going to have Mark Sessumes talk. Mark Sessumes is from the Arlington TMAC Center, which is Texas Manufacturing Assistance Center. I am going to shamelessly send you to our website at growinggreencommunities.com to read his full speaker biography, but I do think that the first few lines here of his biography really clear up and give you a strong understanding of where he comes from. Mark Sessumes has over 30 years of progressive operations management experience in diverse manufacturing and production environments. He's worked in fabrication, assembly, remanufacturing, refurbishment, processing plants for small companies and branch locations of large multi-divisional firms. He also has experience in union and non-union shops. And I want to warn everybody before he gets started, he is a master black belt. So don't mess with him. And Kristi is also a black belt, so this is we're very safe in this room right now. So my cue going into this is let's figure out how can we use these black belts to really spar some optimization, both in our communities and in our local businesses. So with that, Mark, we'll let you start us off.
All right, thanks, Caleb. Appreciate it. In addition to manufacturing, we've also worked extensively in healthcare, construction, municipal governments, etc. So we are well beyond manufacturing, thus the name from Texas Manufacturing Assistance Center to TMAC, because we find that we are able to work with multiple. Everyone should have a worksheet that looks something like this. If you don't have that, let
Thank
Caleb
you for
know.
all sitting in the back where we did not put them. So
Speaking of sitting in the back, I'm going to be drawing some pictures right here. So if you can't see this well, you're welcome to go ahead and move forward. I promise I don't bite or spit. And I was sharing earlier that for once, I'm not in a time slot that's between my audience and lunch, and also not trying to keep people out of a post-lunch coma. So I feel pretty good about being at this time slot. How many of you were in here in the session just prior to this? Okay, a couple. So we had Steve Gilbert from the Paris EDC, and a couple of things that he said that really struck me was that the industries in their community are very interested in a couple of things. First, they recognize that there may be a little disconnect in the way that EDCs and other folks like that measure success and the way that companies measure success. So EDCs, he was saying, they measure a lot on job ads and job additions and things like that, whereas companies are really looking at trying to figure out how do they use what they have more efficiently, more effectively. And so he was painting the picture of a need to really come into alignment with what your customers are actually asking of you. And so we're going to build on that theme as we go through here today. We know that EDCs are very interested in attracting businesses to their communities, but they're also interested in companies staying and growing. I don't know about in your communities, but I have heard of some communities that the outflow of those jobs is outpacing the inflow of new jobs, and that's a real problem. So what we have to do is figure out collectively how do we keep the jobs here that we have, and then in addition to that, add new ones. And so this topic that we're going to be dealing with today, Caleb, is in and around this topic of lean and how we can use that as a strategy to help companies become more sustainable. And when I speak of sustainable, I'm not just talking about, as Steve put it, trying not to offend anyone, but I'm not talking about just tree hugging. I mean, some people are really into that, and that's fine, if that's your thing. When I talk about green, I'm thinking about it from my customer's perspective, and they're talking about this kind of green. They have to remain competitive, because if we don't remain competitive here, those jobs are going to go elsewhere. So we have to be about creating a sustainable effort to keep profits in place, to keep those jobs in place, and so forth. And so central to that theme and how it connects in with our topic of Lean Six Sigma is we talk about, if we look at the total pie of effort that's happening in a company. And I'm talking about machines and people and materials and all of these things. There's a certain amount of that we would call waste. Okay, there's a problem in some way that it's not interacting with the people, machines, materials, etc. in an efficient manner. And so there's more resources going out than what's really necessary. So what we call this non-value added activity. Fancy word. So here's the problem: is there's a certain amount of this non-value added activity that goes on in a company. And if a company grows and doesn't pay attention to this ratio, then as they grow, they're also increasing the amount of waste that happens. So that's a problem. Right? It's a problem from a cost standpoint, it's a problem from an environmental standpoint. So what I want to talk about is what we have discovered in terms of working with companies in order for them to have sustainable results. I'm sure that you would support this issue that we can have lots of fancy techniques, and Lean and Six Sigma bring those kinds of techniques to bear to make companies more competitive. But at the end of the day, virtually all of those techniques must result in a change of human behavior. Either management decisions, either people that actually interact doing the work, etc. There's a change of human behavior that has to take place. And so while these techniques are great, what also must exist is a mechanism by which we change culture and by which we manage the business. And so that's what I want to talk about today, are these three dimensions that make this effective and make it lasting and provide sustainable results. So as we walk through this, what we need to keep in mind is this issue of productivity. Now, when I speak of productivity, what I'm speaking about is something very specific. It's a measure of output. You can think units, you can think dollars, right? It's some measure of output that the organization has in ratio to some measure of input. So obviously what companies are trying to do in order to stay competitive is to increase this productivity. Now the way we do that is we can increase the output, keep input the same. That would raise productivity, right? Okay. We could fiddle with this. We could raise output in greater relation to input. That's okay too. So there's several ways that we can work this equation. And really what we're trying to get to is this concept of enterprise value. And what enterprise value says is that, you know what, we have to grow revenue. We have to be concerned about our expenses, and all of that in relation to some asset. So if you think of the building as an asset, it takes a certain footprint. If you take the equipment as an asset, it takes a certain footprint. Okay? You take trucks, etc., all of that. And so really what we're looking at is how do we do this, generate this revenue, while keeping expenses the same or go down, and keeping assets the same or go down. Everybody get so far? This means yes. Give me some feedback. So let's walk through this, and I'll share with you some of the lessons that we've learned. Okay, so here's my challenge as a speaker. I probably have, I don't know, 2 to 3 hours worth of material to cram in 10 minutes. So it's like showing you an elephant. Right? I can show you 1 square inch of an elephant. Even if we look at that really close, John, we may not know what in the world that is. So instead, what I have to do is show you an elephant real fast. And maybe as it speeds by, you can say, oh, okay, that's an elephant. At least I know what that is, and I can go investigate more if it's interesting. All right, so the first thing that we know in building this sustainable results model is that there's a set of techniques. And you may hear about these techniques. You may hear about a lot of tools that are used. And I think you'll hear more in a bit. There's some more detail. And so I'm not going to spend a lot of time on these techniques. I'm just going to say that there's some broad categories, some broad families of techniques that we can bring to bear to improve the operation. First is, one of the things that we look at is product flow. Now, when I talk about product flow, what I'm talking about in general is the speed or the velocity of the materials moving through that operation to generate revenue. So that's pretty easy to picture if you're manufacturing, right? I mean, it's from dock to dollar, from cash out, spending something on inventory to getting money back. And that, really what we're trying to do is streamline that. So I'll pause for a question. What benefit is that to a company? Exactly right. So we can look at capacity constraints issues. We can look at, just all kinds of ways to be looking at increasing our productivity, contributing to increasing our enterprise value so that we change this ratio right here. Okay? It's all about that. Lots of techniques to do that. A couple of other ones, process quality, because what we don't want to be about is just making bad stuff faster. And this doesn't matter if you're a restaurant, it doesn't matter if you're in distribution, warehousing, it doesn't matter if you're in healthcare. We have to look at process quality, and there's a lot of different tools to be able to do that. And Kristi is going to share with you a little bit more depth in and around these two topics here in a minute and give you a framework that kind of drills down even further. Third, equipment performance. Now let's just think about this rationally. What happens if that equipment is not performing well? Well, what happens is we end up buying more equipment that we don't really need if the first set of equipment was working the way it should in the first place. So now all of a sudden we have a need for more space, more building, etc., and all of that has a negative effect on the environment. So when we look at increasing productivity, we often look at this equipment performance issue. Material productivity. Here's something really simple that we find pretty doggone effective that you can use every day when you go and visit companies of any kind. For a moment, think about the property line of the business. And we know that that there's stuff that crosses that property line, regardless of what kind of property line it is. Now, we also know that there's stuff that's coming out that generates the dollars, right? It's the things that we trade for money, or the companies trade for money. Everything else is either consumed or wasted in that operation. So this is just a quick and easy analysis. We can take a look at water usage. All right, and water coming in, how much water is actually contained in the product that we sell? Well, in most cases, we're not selling water balloons. So what that means is that it's some sort of an expense that's happening. So we ought to be able to focus on that and look at how do we begin reducing that expense. Well, likewise, if we take the entire property line and begin diving down into single operations that occur all over that place, we can do the same thing. We can take a look at a single operation and look at what's coming in, what's going out in the form of the sellable product, everything else, gloves, paper clips, paper, you name it, is all contributing to expenses. And that helps us to focus. Now we can see, where do we need to focus? What's driving the expense? How do we get together to figure out ways to reduce that using some of these techniques? Everybody okay conceptually? Let's be dead. All right, energy efficiency. That's another piece. We have to be looking at this. Energy is a bigger and bigger deal. Okay, and then finally, product design. Now, a lot of companies don't own their own design, but if they do, they have choices in how that product is designed. Right, Caleb? As you come out of that arena. And what we know is if that product isn't designed correctly, then it hurts the rest of these strategies of product flow, process quality, equipment performance, and the like. Okay, so we have to be looking at that. But the story isn't over. There's a lot of techniques, a lot of things we can bring to bear to make these processes and people perform better. But we also have to consider this issue of culture. Now, by culture, what I mean is the sum of the daily habits. So when we're looking at really transforming an organization to become more sustainable, you can't separate the culture. You can't ignore it. We have to understand that there's work there too. What kind of work? Well, things like, first, if we have a dysfunctional management team, it's going to be really difficult to make cultural things stick, or the right cultural things stick. So we work with companies there, but also things like safety and standardization, social responsibility, even self-discipline. You know, these are all critical aspects of making the model work. And then finally, this final piece is governance. Now what I mean by governance is specific roles and responsibilities. In other words, it's who's on first and what should they be doing. So one of the things you'll hear from Kristi is, if we're looking at a full-scale initiative, not just, you know, trimming around the edges, but a really full-scale initiative of how do we become more productive so that we increase enterprise value, then we have to have everybody aligned and focused and pulling the right way. Okay? There's a difference between dabbling and a strategic initiative. That's this deal of governance. And we know first it has to start with top leadership. They have to focus, align, engage, and inspire the workforce. And there's lots of different ways to do that. But there's certain things that they have to do in order to accomplish that. Something called value stream managers. Real quickly, for most organizations, they end up in silos. You guys have seen this maybe even in your own organizational structures. And we have point people that usually oversee these silos. And these point people are looking down inside their silo to make things as best as they can make them. In other words, what they're looking at is, how do I optimize my silo? Well, one of the things that ignores is something called systems theory. And systems theory says that we have to look at how do we optimize the whole, and simply because we optimize each piece does not necessarily mean that we're optimizing the whole. Think of washing and drying a load of jeans. If I cut the wash cycle in half, right, do I get more dry jeans out of the process? No, because I don't know about your place. My place, those jeans take about an hour to dry, wash about 20, 30 minutes. So I can cut the wash cycle in half, and they get real efficient, but I'm not going to get any more out through the system. So that's what we have to look at. We have to look horizontally in order to make a lot of these improvements. That's the role of the value stream manager. Third, supervision. What we've seen is that, particularly for culture, supervision becomes the key owner of how do you transition a culture. In other words, leadership can define the kind of culture that you want. Maybe these attributes over off to the right. But if we look at day-to-day behavior, who is it that's in the best position to change daily behavior? We think it's supervision. So we have to have those folks on board. We have to give them the ability to improve methods, improve job safety. We have to give them methods to standardize the work, create good job relations, etc. And then finally, the workforce itself. One of the things that you'll hear from Kristi is that, the days of old whereby management was somehow supposed to come up with all of the ideas to make things better is sort of yesteryear. What we understand is that really getting everyone's head engaged in the game to make their job better, based on a certain set of principles, techniques, etc., is really what we're shooting for. And collectively, making the operation, regardless if it's warehousing, regardless if it's manufacturing or healthcare or whatever, we have to have all of those people going in together. And then finally, a coach. Somebody has to know these roles, these responsibilities, and how to equip those roles with the ability to fulfill those responsibilities. Somebody has to know that. Now, what TMAC does is, in the short term, that's our role. But what we also want to do is equip these other 4 roles with the ability to accomplish their responsibilities. That's key. So what we figured out on this show is it's not just about the techniques. You'll hear a lot about techniques. But if you're really going to transform an organization to make it sustainable, we know that it's also a matter of culture and a matter of governance. I mean, if we think about this, I've seen a lot of companies where they get very, very frustrated. They say, Mark, you know, we've applied some of these techniques and they're not staying in place. We'll get better to only slip back. What's going on? Because we're really good at understanding the tools. We understand the techniques. But what they've not done is maybe they're only halfway dealing with culture. And maybe they're only halfway dealing with governance. So you do the math. That's why they're frustrated. So when we're looking at doing a lean initiative, what we have to consider is all three of these dimensions. And maybe Kristi can comment on you know, how these have affected their deployment, what have they done, et cetera, at the work level. So one of the things also that Steve mentioned is that, you know, the companies in his area have identified that innovative practices, technology, tools, and knowledge are really, really critical. One of the things that Lean Six Sigma provides is a very specific body of knowledge to how to translate from some abstract direction to something very specific that they can do to make it meaningful so that they can improve their production outputs and their human capital productivity. And Steve said those were key in retaining and attracting companies in Paris, Texas. So I think maybe I have maybe 1 or 2 minutes for a quick question, and then we'll transition.
Any questions?
Everybody see that elephant run by?
Did anybody see the elephant? No man. I saw one up here. Good. And keep your questions. Go ahead and write those down. We may have a few minutes also at the end. We'll have to transition to. Gentlemen in the back, you're free to come forward. Go ahead and take yourself a seat. Get comfortable right up here close so I can pick on you. Make sure you stay awake throughout the rest of what we have going on. So with that, let's move forward. We have Kristi, who is the Manager of Organizational Development for City University and the City of Tyler. I can tell you that I think that this is absolutely a great resource. When we were talking about in some previous sessions this morning, they were talking about the triple bottom line, and one of those elements was people. And I think that what Kristi's organization does truly shows that in Tyler, Texas, their people that work for them are important. And we'll let her talk about the great things that they're doing in Tyler. With that, Kristi,
Okay, thank you, Caleb. Okay, I want you all to move back in time with me for a minute. It's the end of 2007, 2008. The housing market's crashing. We're seeing property taxes decreasing. Our sales tax is lower than any time before in recent years. And city leaders are starting to think about how are we going to continue to provide premium services to our citizens with less revenue and less resources. So what they started thinking about was lean manufacturing and Six Sigma. And we liked both methodologies. So we just combined it and we call it Lean Sigma. So it's focused on eliminating waste and reducing variation in business processes. And it can be in any type of process. So why did we decide this was our answer? Well, our city has a long history of continuous improvement. It really started in about 1997. We adopted the Blueprint business model. And it is our culture that tells us our mission, our vision, and our core values. And this is our mission, to create a citizen-sensitive and customer-oriented environment where all city services are quality-driven in the most appropriate, cost-conscious manner. We want to run our city like a business, and so we've been doing that since 1997. So how are we going to roll out this Lean Sigma program across the board at the City of Tyler? Because we've seen a couple cities do this maybe in one department or in one area, and so we have to decide, do we want to do it case by case, or do we want to do citywide? So our leaders decided, let's do it citywide. Then we were like, well, do we want to hire a consultant who will come in and teach us the techniques that Mark talked about and then go away and we're kind of on our own, or should we hire a master black belt, put him on staff? Well, that's what we decided to do. So we put together a deployment plan, and in 2009, they started interviewing master black belts from the manufacturing industry, because that's mainly where they're at. And we found a great guy who was in the car and manufacturing industry, but he could relate it to city processes, and he had that great crossover potential. And so they hired Guillermo. He started developing curriculum that would make sense to city employees. And they started by teaching the key leaders, the executive team, and we called it Blue Belt training. It was a one-day introductory course to just give you a broad overview of what Lean Sigma is. After that, he went around and talked to each leader about what processes do you see that might be broken or could be improved, and translating those into possible projects. Then we trained the department and developing leaders as Blue Belts. And finally, we started spreading the word throughout the organization because we wanted the employees to be excited about this idea, because they would be able to make their own processes, make their own job easier. So, through the past 3 years, we have trained 123 in the Blue Belt training. We have 27 Green Belts, which means that they've gone through 40 hours of training. And I think historically it's a full 40-hour week. But what we did was split it up into half days for a week over a 3-month period. So it would not take them totally out of their current job. And then we had 4 people who went on to do 40 more hours of training, and I was one of those 4 who became black belts. And of course we have our one master black belt there on staff. So I want to show you a few examples of how Lean Sigma has affected our processes, and I've picked out a few projects that also relate to being green. So this first one is Justin's project. He is the assistant traffic engineer, and he wanted to look at the traffic signal corridor retiming. So he was looking at Beckham, Troop, Highway 110. It has like 5 names. It's crazy. In the back row, yes, Becky back there. She knows what
I was wondering if you did the same thing on Broadway.
Yeah, actually they are doing that. But they're looking at how can we get traffic flowing, have less stops, shorter travel time, less delays in this area where there's not only restaurants and stores, but there's also doctor's offices and 2 hospitals and the largest church I've ever seen. So, the whole thing with Lean Sigma is you're going to define the problem, measure it, analyze it, improve it, and control it. DMAC is kind of what we call it for certain. So, in the define phase, you're going to start with a project charter. What is the problem? Do your problem statement, and then what's your objective? So he found that the time it takes you to go from one end to the other on this road was just way too long. He has the actual seconds for northbound and southbound traffic. So, and there's also defect rates and PPM, all these great tools that can be used to calculate how a process is working. And so, like I was just talking about, what's critical to the customer? They want fewer stops, they want a shorter travel time, they want less delay. So we started looking at each section of Cross Street. He graded it. He developed a new method for creating a signal timing to address the level of service. So he's grading it for A to F, just like in school. And he decided, well, let's relate that to the sigma value. So a 0 sigma would be gridlock. That's an F. But then 3 sigma, it's about normal. It's a C, maybe a D. And then a 6 sigma would be an A. And free flow. Free flow of traffic at the posted speed limit. nephew left. My husband always talks about electric cars and we're just drove around ourselves and don't have to think about it. The street does all the work, but maybe one day. So he used all sorts of techniques and cycle times and things to analyze and finally came up with this reconfiguration. He determined the optimal solution, and this is what actually came out of the process capability. We found that from adjusting the signal lights with this programming that we have, we saved fuel, the emissions that were going into the environment were less, we saved our citizens time who were traveling on this road, and then you see the total dollar amount. But with every project, you must control the new process and sustain it, like Mark touched on. And so to do that, we go into the control phase and we have to implement something that would let anyone who comes along be able to pick it up and start where he left off in case he went on vacation, was sick, or left the city employment. So he created a signal timing workbook. So he has all the information in there. So anyone can come by and pick it up. So, my second project I want to tell you about is optimizing magnesium dosage usage. And this is at our wastewater treatment plant. I might be a little sneaky, but that's kind of what magnesium is for. So this is Sherry's project. And they were looking at, well, we are spending a lot of money on this magnesium that we put in the water, the wastewater. And what's really going on with that? So we have to test it. There's TCEQ standards we have right here that the standard minimum 6, the maximum 9 according to TCEQ. And they found that the dosage usage was actually sporadic. And so they started really looking and doing cycle times and watching who's putting in what and really seeing how much this magnesium will do what over here. And so they were adding to the wastewater an average rate of 365 gallons a day, adding magnesium at that rate. So when you're looking at the different utility people putting in magnesium, they're seeing different amounts are going in at different times, and so they plotted it on this line plot. And they found that the influent pH level changes very little whether the dosage is 12 gallons or 55 gallons. So you could be putting a lot in there, spending a lot of money, and it's really not doing anything better than the less amount. So eventually they decided on what is the correct amount, when to do it, and in their control phase, they look at how much money they're saving, and they look at those dosage every month and keep a track of it. They thought the hard dollar savings would be a little over $77,000. In actuality, it came out to be a little over $66,000 so far. But I've really oversimplified these projects just for the sake of time. But I want you to remember that these projects have many more slides. They all do a storyboard. And a typical project takes 6 months to a year. It's a lot of looking at the processes and also doing their current job. So they're working on a project and still doing the regular job. So, another thing to remember though, is that it's not done alone by the Green Belt. They have a team that they assemble. They choose who their team's going to be, and it's really the people who are doing those processes. And our overall outcomes have seen that our evolution of our lean and quality-driven culture is getting stronger. And our internal audit is being called to serve, and serve is actually an acronym for streamline, empower, respond, venture, and evaluate. And we're really reaching all levels of the organization through the project teams. And it's great to see that the employees who are doing these processes, someone's not coming in and saying, hey, you need to do it this way. They're getting together and they're thinking in a way that would make it easier and make it their job more efficient. So in the end, the solutions are driven by the people who are actually involved in the process. And since 2010, we have saved more than $2 million. We're about to have a party. We're really excited about that. Maybe just hot dogs and cake. Yes, ma'am?
I was wondering, did the employees who work on the projects get a bonus? Did it split some of the money? So the money's saved every year.
Right.
They get money.
What we
from the
do
first
is, depending on the level of the project and how much we think that each greenbelt has really understood the techniques and tools, they might complete one project, or maybe it'll take 2 projects for us to decide that they get certification pay. So they get about, I think it's $36 a month extra.
That's a great question. Is it
Yeah.
in what we talked about earlier, is one of the responsibilities of top leadership is to figure out how to focus, align, inspire, and engage the workforce. So they have to figure out how are they gonna get that response and participation.
Right, and every September, the employees apply to be a greenbelt. They want to, and we have to turn some away because we actually, our first group was 10 people, then the next year we were like, yeah, let's do 20 people, and we were like, okay, we need to back off of that. That's kind of, over maximizing the Master Black Belt's time, because he's going around mentoring and helping them all with their projects, and so we backed it back down to 9 people.
And once they go through this process, their pay gets increased?
No, they get certification pay.
Certification. It was increased before. Increasing, certification increases their salary.
Right, by $36 a month. And then if you go on and get trained and do more projects as a black belt, then you get, I think, $150.
Good. Let's congratulate Tyler on saving $2 million.
Yeah.
For either of our speakers, we have a little bit of time to talk about this in detail through question and answer. Anybody have additional questions? Can anybody think of a stoplight that they would now like to talk to the individual at Tyler to figure out how they can show a cost savings by not having to stop there every day? So I have-
Doing it on Broadway, along the mall, and then around our loop as well. And you can really tell the difference, and you're not just stopping at every light, getting like 4 green in a row.
Well, I can tell you from a team's perspective, in terms of sitting in on meetings and leadership meetings, that our team at Representative Roger Caldwell's on, what this always comes back to every time that recent projects is when we're talking about lean and we're talking about Six Sigma and those things, it always comes back to bottom line. So either making money, saving money, or creating jobs, and that's how they're able to use those monies. They're able to optimize those resources. And so, really a great opportunity. And if you're in the Arlington area or in that general region, I'm sure that Mark will be happy to talk to you if you have any companies that come to mind, or if you in your own office. And then I'm sure that over in Tyler, Texas, they'd be happy to give you a tour around their facility. If there's not any other questions, I do have a couple housekeeping items I need to